So, if you're crazy enough to learn Chinese, you know that the hardest part is trying to learn the written language. With thousands upon thousands of characters, learning how to read and how to write requires a huge investment of time. And of course, the best way to learn how to read all those characters is to learn how to write all those characters. And nobody wants to do that, and I'm serious about this. Nobody who learns this language wants to take all that time to learn all the characters properly. I know this is true not just because of my own experience, I know this because you guys keep telling me this. And I keep running into people who wish that they could simply learn Chinese without learning the written language. I mean, you might think that learning the spoken language is good enough. The truth, though, is that learning the spoken language without learning the written language will severely limit your ability to actually learn high-level Chinese. In other words, if you want to seriously make progress in the language, you're going to have to deal with Chinese characters sooner or later. But the question, of course, is why in the world do they still have these Chinese characters, right? Why hasn't the language, evolved over all these years? Why don't they just dump the characters aside and use Pinyin instead? Well, today I'm going to tell you why the characters are still around. You see, believe it or not, there actually was a movement around the end of the Qing dynasty to completely abolish Chinese characters altogether. And there's a really good reason why that movement failed. So take this guy, for example. This is Chen Duxiu, one of the original founders of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Chen Duxiu was a brilliant intellectual who was extremely frustrated with the feudal society of the late years of the Qing dynasty. In fact, Chen Duxiu called for the entire abolishment of Chinese characters back in 1918, and he wasn't the only one. Lu Xun, who you've probably heard of, famously said that China would perish if the country wouldn't abandon Chinese characters altogether. And there was the famous linguist Qian Xuantong who argued that Chinese thought couldn't change until the country abandoned the characters altogether. So, the reason why I bring this up is because if you're frustrated with Chinese characters, really, you're not alone. There are a whole bunch of, Chinese people from 100-something years ago who felt similar to how you did, though for different reasons, right? These guys were upset about the feudal aspects of society. They wanted to see their country move into modernity, right? They wanted to see something similar to, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, where Japan was taking in a lot of Western influence, right? You have to realize, though, that these guys had different motivations, right? This wasn't about making it so that Chinese was easier for foreigners to learn. Rather, the thought was that this is the way to join the rest of the world. The thing is that back in those days, these literary scholars, right? This isn't just some random dude off the street. This isn't some punk kid who doesn't want to do his homework. These were literary scholars. These guys felt that China's thousands of years of literary history is precisely what was holding the country back. And the funny thing is that there was a technological reason for them to feel this way. As Thomas Mullany explains so clearly in this awesome book, The Chinese Language was behind the times primarily because the concept of a Chinese typewriter was initially just an impossibility. You see, if you look up things like the Chinese typewriter, you'll come up with these cartoons from back in the late 19th century. This one's from the San Francisco Examiner, and it's horribly racist. The idea of somehow creating a machine that was capable of typing 30,000 or more characters was insane at the time and seemed to show that the Chinese language desperately needed to evolve. This caused journalists at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat to talk about an author needing to take an elevator just to find the proper key on a Chinese typewriter. This is from 1901. Now, of course, the technological problem eventually was solved, but what you need to understand is that the difficulty of learning all those characters was apparently seen as at least some sort of a problem in other Asian countries as well, at least to some extent. After all, alphabets did evolve in other countries in those days, as well as various simplified forms of writing. So, for example, if you look at something like Cao Shu or the cursive style of Chinese writing, you'll notice that there were a bunch of simplifications there. And as noted in this somewhat dated book, A History of Writing in Japan, both of the kana systems in Japan came directly from that cursive style of writing. And those alphabets originally emerged as a way of helping Buddhist monks read scripture written in Chinese characters aloud in Japanese. In other words, these things were chiefly grammatical markers way back in the beginning. So in contrast, the Hangul alphabet in Korea was developed entirely independent of Chinese characters. It's actually remarkable because it's a rare example of a relatively modern and completely independent writing system. But of course, it really wasn't until the famous Gapo reforms in response to peasant uprisings in the late 19th century that Hangul started to be commonly used in Korea. In other words, the alphabet originally was not really a substitute for Chinese characters. And honestly, like, these pesky historical facts really make this video hard to create, right? It would be really nice if it were really smooth and simple, and I could tell you that, well, the Chinese characters were too hard, and so people naturally came up with better ways of writing their native language than relying on Chinese characters. The problem with that is that it's just not true. In fact, in most cases, the new alphabets came along to supplement the Chinese characters, not to replace them. And you can still see that today if you read Japanese, especially if you're reading advanced or academic texts, right? You get like tons of kanji, mostly stuff you've never seen before, and the kana that does exist is usually to mark grammatical functions. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the Romanization that later became Quoc Ngu was a missionary tool to help teach foreign concepts to the Vietnamese. Of course, separating the Vietnamese from Chinese influence helped out the French colonizers quite a bit. That's probably the reason why they actually used this Romanized alphabet as the official language once they took over. But the thing is that in the early 20th century, a number of very prominent Vietnamese nationalists also favored Quoc Ngu as a tool for fighting against illiteracy. Just like in China, in Vietnam there was a general feeling that getting rid of Chinese characters was a necessary step towards modernization. So when you really sit down and think about it, you'll realize that that kind of thought process had tons and tons of social Darwinism behind it, right? I mean, the idea here was that Chinese was an older or an unevolved language, that it was hieroglyphic in nature, and that the only way to join up with the rest of the world was to push towards modernity. Now, if you look at this from an actual, like, objective standpoint, like if you look at how languages actually work, you'll realize that there's nothing about an alphabetic language that makes it superior to a so-called hieroglyphic, or I would say a character-based language like Chinese. Really, there's not much of a difference between the two. The languages can do the same things, right? In fact, the fact that you have to memorize whatever it is, 5,000 to 6,000 characters to become fluent in Chinese doesn't mean that, like, nobody in China is fluent in Chinese, right? This is all a whole bunch of, like, biased thinking that was common back in those days. But back then, people really did believe this, especially because so many of these countries, China, Vietnam, Korea at the time, were so impoverished, right? This is the reason why the idea back then was that you had to ditch the writing brush and embrace the typewriter, if that makes sense. Of course, the first Chinese romanization system that really got a lot of attention was the famous Wade-Giles system, which was in heavy use back in those days. You do see this system show up today. It's mostly in academic writings, though it is slowly falling out of favor. Of course, the truth is that Wade-Giles was really only useful for teaching people who could read English already how to learn to read Chinese words, and even then the system was pretty awful. Native speakers of Chinese would use the old Bopomofo system instead, which dates back to the early 1910s. Of course, the problem with Wade-Giles is that it requires a bunch of, like, apostrophes that many authors neglect to include in their books, and the problem with Bopomofo is that you have to learn a different alphabet. And in the end, the development and spread of Pinyin made all of this obsolete anyway. So the thing is that Pinyin is like the perfect system for representing Chinese characters in like English or using alphabetic Roman characters and letters because it was created specifically for the Chinese language. What I mean by that is that Pinyin actually reflects the way the Chinese is actually spoken, at least the way that standard Chinese is spoken. So it doesn't need apostrophes. There isn't like some other random alphabet that's created. There's not a ton of like crazy diacritic markings and things like that. It was designed to be as simple as possible because it was designed to be a tool to help people learn how to read characters they didn't know, right? And the thing is, I can't really imagine learning Chinese any other way. It's such a natural fit to the language. I mean, honestly, it's sort of like if you tried to learn Korean without learning Hangul. It would be impossible, right? Because like Hangul is the perfect way for the Korean language to be like formed and to be shaped. If you try to learn it any other way, like using, Romanization, I don't even know how you would start, right? It'd be impossible, right? But what you need to understand is that Pinyin was actually not intended to replace Chinese characters. It never was. However, The newspaper reports from 1958, when it came out, would have you believe otherwise. So when Pinyin first came around in 1958, reports went out around the world, thanks to Reuters, that China was going to adopt the alphabet for good. There was apparently talk back in those days about having Pinyin replace characters everywhere, making it so that kids could graduate from school more quickly or something. And everybody talked about how the motivation was to handle the fact that only about 30% of China's population was literate at that time. But the thing is that illiteracy had nothing to do with the characters, right? There's two problems here, right? The first problem is, what does literate mean, right? Nobody ever talks about this when they talk about literacy rates. You see this in the United States all the time where they say, well, adult literacy is at such a high rate or whatever. Well, it depends on what you define as being literate, right? Does it mean having the ability to read words? If you watch Beavis and Butthead, you'll see that they can kind of make out words at like a first grade level, right? I mean, technically that would be literate according to some definitions. According to others, it might not be, right? That's one thing to think about. The second thing to think about, of course, is that it really has nothing to do with the characters. I mean, they did, in the end, simplify the writing system, but Chinese-speaking places that did not go through simplified characters, places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, still had very, very high rates of literacy, despite the fact that the characters weren't made simple. In other words, you can learn Chinese with traditional characters or with simplified characters. Either way, you can learn how to read and write the language, right? It's not like the only thing they could do was simplify the characters to fight the illiteracy rate, right? So it turns out that economic development and government programs help a lot with raising the rate of literacy. That, of course, plus not having, devastating wars every couple of years. But the funny thing about those old articles is that they were completely wrong in the end. In fact, as quoted here, Zhou Enlai noted at the time that Pinyin was not supposed to replace the characters, though most of these articles didn't report that part. However, the implication here was that Chinese characters would wind up being some sort of trivial academic topic, which is something that clearly never happened. And of course, this is never going to happen in China, right? The problem is that there are tons and tons of homophones in the language. What I mean by that are, different characters that have the same pronunciation. So if you get rid of the characters altogether, you're going to have a lot of problems. I mean, the most famous example of this is probably this poem, which is The Lion-Eating Poet in the Stone Den, where every single character is read as shi. As you can see, if you take the characters away, there is simply no way to understand the poem. But you run into these problems in real life as well. So for example, take the Korean word sagwa. One of the first things that you learn when you study Korean is that sagwa means apple, which seems easy enough. But the problem is that it also means apology, and the only way to distinguish those two meanings, aside from the context, is through knowing the hanja. And you run into the same problem if you look at the phrase che sagwa, which means either my apple or the fourth chapter, like the fourth chapter in a textbook, right? So I learned that the hard way back when I was taking Korean class all those years ago, right? It was a joke that I liked to make, and the teacher would give me this really weird look, right? You know how it is. Anyway, if you're having a conversation with somebody, you won't even notice this. It's like when you're speaking with someone in Chinese and you're using a word that could mean multiple things. The thing is that you have a lot of context to rely on, right? That's why these are very context-heavy languages, right? But the problem is that when you're reading the language as a foreigner, if you run into something like this and there's no Chinese characters to help you out, you're going to be really, really confused, right? Because the pronunciation is the same, the words are written exactly the same way, and they have the same grammatical function. So all of the shortcuts you have to figure this out have gone away, and yet they have two completely different meanings. So you get a lot of this in Japanese as well, where you get a word like shiritsu that has two different meanings. Now, the only way to distinguish these two meanings is through the kanji. In other words, the characters really do make your life easier. Of course, the funniest example of all of this is the old Vietnamese dynasty Dai Nu, which lasted for 7 years in the early 15th century. So the character for Nu is a reference to a legendary Chinese dynasty that may or may not have actually existed. The problem, of course, is that Dai Nu, with exactly the same tones and diacritics, also means extremely foolish or very stupid. And you can find this if you look around online. Like there are websites that tell Vietnamese school children that, no, we didn't have a dynasty called the Great Stupid, right? But that's what it looks like to them at first. So as you can see, like knowing the Chinese characters really does help out in a lot of really practical ways, right? They do mean something, and the difference between characters with the same pronunciation still does mean something, right? Now, naturally, if you're Chinese, if you're like naming your child or whatever, you're going to try your hardest not to accidentally give them a name that's like going to make fun of them. It does happen sometimes. I've met some people who've been through that, who had to change their name later on when they figured this out and all that stuff. But, you know, most Chinese parents try to avoid stuff like that. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that in books like Dream of the Red Chamber, which is what this channel is technically about, you can see the same sort of thing happen, right? The characters do make a difference, even though you might not fully realize this at first. So, for example, Shui Bao Chai's given name, which is Chai, includes the character Jin on the side. That means gold. And her relationship with Jia Bao Yu is often referred to in the book as Jin Yu Liang Yuan, which is the match between gold and jade. Meanwhile, Lin Daiyu's surname, Lin, contains the character Mu, or wood. Actually, it contains the character twice, right? That's what Shuang Mu Lin means, or the character Lin. And her relationship with Jia Bao Yu is referred to in the book as Mu Shi Qian Meng, which is the premortal alliance between wood and stone. But the thing is, you lose all of that if you don't look at the characters anymore. This is a great example of the sort of thing that's very, very difficult to translate into English, right? These sort of references are like all over the book. You can see it and understand it if you read Chinese. If you're an ignorant foreigner like me trying to read the book, like sometimes you'll see it, sometimes you won't. I have to be like, well, let me go see what so-and-so has written about this. Does anybody say what this weird poem means? And then you start catching on and you're like, oh, this is actually really cool, right? If you're a native speaker, maybe it happens faster, maybe it doesn't. I don't know, you guys tell me. But that's the thing about Chinese characters everybody wants to ignore, right? The characters themselves also mean something, right? This isn't just an arbitrary writing system. The unfortunate thing, though, is that you'll only understand that there is this inherent meaning to Chinese characters themselves once you take the time to actually, learn how to read and write Chinese. If you don't experience it, it will never make sense to you, and instead you watch people like me say this stuff that sounds like gobbledygook. And frankly, that's the way that things are with Chinese calligraphy as well. You see, Chinese characters are not just about conveying like a message from one person to the other. When it comes to some of these highly valued works of calligraphy, the characters themselves contain a certain kind of meaning and emotion based on how they were written. In other words, Chinese characters are sort of like a language within a language. And if that doesn't inspire you to want to really learn the language, like how to read and write the language, I'm not sure what will. Now, if you are learning Chinese, give the characters a serious attempt, right? It's okay if you struggle at first. I struggled a lot at first when I started learning this language, whatever it was, 20-something years ago. In fact, I can remember very vividly, frantically practicing characters before my Chinese 101 tests, hoping that I would remember how to, write them and get a grade that was somewhat respectable. But, like I said, you're never going to fully understand the language, and you're never going to hit those advanced levels of competency until you really devote some time to seriously studying the characters. And the truth is that those characters are never going to go away.